This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, everyone in between, cultural workers, and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Fred Moten, who teaches in the Department of Performance Studies at New York University. He is the author of a number of volumes of poetry, including most recently All That Beauty from 2019 and Perennial Fashion, Presents Falling from 2023, and multiple critical books that include In the Break from 2003, the trilogy Consent Not to Be a Single Being, published in 2017 and 2018, and with Stefano Harney, the groundbreaking The Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study from 2013. In this conversation, we discuss the nature of the field of Black studies, what lessons it has for thinking politically in the present moment, and how Black study transforms notions of liberation struggle, Black life, and expressive culture. Hello, Fred. How are you doing?
I'm good, John. How are you?
I'm all right. As we just got ready to hit record, we're in the second week of the new government, so it's a little nerves frayed, but yeah, starting the semester and sort of taking next steps with this Black Studies podcast. And so welcome to the podcast. I'm so glad that you made the time. We found the time to talk for a lot of reasons. I think really first among them, your contribution to this field has just been massive not only as a theorist and an innovator, but also I think, and I just want to say this from the beginning, I think that you've embodied in your scholarship and creative work so much of what the promise of Black studies is around our possibilities for expressing ideas, experiences, engaging traditions, forging new paths. And so having you on this podcast is a real treat for me. I really love your work, but also just for anyone listening and following the series, I think you're a really important figure in the field, and having your voice as part of this is a big deal to us. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be part of it and to join the great company of people who've already been on the podcast. So learned a lot from listening to them. So I'm really happy to be a part of it.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. I know this will be a great listen for everyone. And so I appreciate your thoughtfulness in all of this conversation to come. And I wanted to start out before really talking about sort of your imagination of the field of Black studies and the relationship of your own work to it. I want to start off with a question that's really just about you and your own journey as an intellectual. So what drew you to the study of Black life? What drew you to Black studies? And always for me, something that's an interesting part of it, what sustains you and keeps you committed to this study, to this field?
Oh man, I don't know that anything drew me to Black studies. I really sincerely think that I was just born into it.
Mm-hmm.
My mom was a teacher. She was a elementary school teacher when I was born in 1962, and then she was a high school teacher starting in 1968, partly because in Las Vegas, which was still deeply segregated when I was born, they didn't have Black teachers teaching in the secondary schools until the late 60s. And my mom was very interested in sociology. She was a sociology major in college, and she was always, I think at one point she had intended to get her PhD in sociology, but circumstances prevented it for various reasons. But I remember from early days listening to her talk about, Horace Mann Bond and Hortense Powdermaker and John Dollard, and especially E. Franklin Frazier. So I just feel I grew up in an atmosphere in which those questions were real. And I remember my parents sent me to a almost all white private school in Las Vegas, in part because my mom just didn't believe it was a complicated thing. She taught in the public schools, and I think she was a great teacher and did as great a job as she could, but she was concerned that what was going on in the public schools was not enough for, she had the resources, or at least scraped up the resources to send me to something that she thought was better. But every February, when they used to have what was then Black History Week, as opposed to Black History Month, she
Yeah.
would take me out of my school and bring me to her school. And so I guess in a way, my early exposure to Black studies was the sort of programming and curriculum that my mom used to do for her kids, for students in the schools that she taught in Vegas. So I kind of feel like I don't remember there was a moment when I kind of wasn't in Black studies,
That's interesting. How did that, I mean, what was it then like to arrive, in college and graduate school, it was sort of with that as your frame of sort of what were the important ideas? Because that's of course always, for everybody at some, multiple registers, a transition.
When I was, I would say that when I went to college, what I took with me in terms of my sort of nascent learning at the time was again much more embedded in Black culture. It was primarily music and the intensity with which my mom listened to music, but it was also, Black folklore, Black vernacular speech, just sort of everyday, the everyday sort of atmosphere that emerged around what it is that the Black people in my neighborhood and in my world did, I'm thinking of my old buddy, R.A. Judy, and the way he just talks about what it means to be interested in and invested in what Black people do. And I was immersed in not only what Black people did, but also in the way that Black people thought about what they did and in the way that they talked about what they did, so that there was always a critical discourse that accompanied what it is that people were doing. It was as much a part of what people were doing as every other thing. So, that was the atmosphere again in which I was raised. And it was also a pretty explicitly what maybe one might call I won't call it a political atmosphere, but let's say it was an activist atmosphere. It was an atmosphere of resistance and of, let's say, community building. That was fundamental to it. So I was raised in that, and I went to school, went to college, with that. And that was already given for me, in Las Vegas. But then in many ways, it was intensified my last 2 years because when I was in Arkansas, living with my mother and my grandmother for 1 year, and then just with my grandmother my last year. And there I was really, let's say, reintroduced to a certain sense of the roots of what I had been involved in Vegas, particularly around sort of Black church culture and stuff like that. So when I went to college, that was what I went with. And I would say that maybe I say this now retrospectively, because I don't know if I thought about it this way then, but what I had was not only, maybe like a body of knowledge, some facts, some texts, maybe, but also there was a kind of an attitude or a sensibility. I won't say that it was an episteme. I think it's something deeper, maybe, and broader than that. Maybe a structure of feeling. Maybe that's a better word for it. A structure of feeling that was inseparable from a range of modalities of thinking, let's say. And so what it meant is that I was kind of open to learning a whole bunch of other stuff. I was open to new things. I wasn't probably, I wasn't in the first instance, maybe, in a way, I guess I had been so prepared to understand certain basic modalities of let's say white culture as an antithetical to Black subsistence. I knew that, but I was kind of maybe a little bit open and willing to see what else there was in white culture. Maybe there were some other things going on with white people that weren't so bad. And I think I was kind of prepared for that too, by my mom, by my grandma, and by, the openness they had, And I believe that the openness they had to the possibility that there might be something other than completely genocidal about certain aspects of European culture. I think that the reason that they were open to that was that I believe that they were just so sure already about the value, if you want to use that word, of their own culture, right? Like they were so secure and the beauty and the value of the way that they did things and the way that they thought about things and the way that they talked and the way that they sounded and the way that their food tasted and the way that they moved. They were so secure about that, that it prevented that sometimes this kind of reflex, that would reject or react negatively. And by the same token, as much as they were secure in the knowledge of the beauty of what they did, they were also completely critically well versed in the brutalities and of the structure that placed them under duress. Right. So one way to put it would be, I didn't go to college needing to find out about Black stuff. I didn't go to college needing to find out that Black stuff was beautiful. Nor did I go to college in a way that allowed me to be surprised by the evil of anti-Black stuff. And I didn't need to be introduced, to the technical specificities of that evil. So maybe I think I was very well prepared, I guess would be the best way to put it,
Yeah, no, I say this all the time, but this is some of my favorite parts of the podcast is hearing people's sort of journeys to Black studies and to, an embeddedness and enmeshment with Black ideas and history. And I really, it's the thing that's going to stick with me, the way you said it wasn't just Black stuff that you grew up with and sort of captivated by or sort of captured you, but also the discourse about it internal to that life itself. I think that's interesting at so many levels. But as I hear that resonate in how you just ended that characterization of how you enter undergraduate college. You already have that sense of, it creates a space of both curiosity and persistence and thriving all at once. Yeah. And I'm sure it'll come back to lots of this, because I also hear so much stuff about so much in what you just said in your own work, right? I can see this as part of this trajectory, your intellectual trajectory. But before we get to your work specifically and how to think about it in relation to Black studies, I'm interested in how you imagine the field, or what that phrase Black studies says to you. And I'm asking specifically, I guess, in terms of the origins of the field, which had that tension between the demand for the study of the intellectual tradition and the intellectual lives and cultural lives of Black people, something that universities hadn't, had as part of their life, student demands for that. But at the same time, of course, late 1960s, early 1970s, this is the moment of militant Black liberation struggle that had really collapsed that boundary between, say, study and action, between politics of a community and politics of a campus. And so Black studies also has that political demand to it, that, that what Black studies does, has a prescriptive political dimension. It also has a descriptive, contemplative, expressive tradition as part of it. And so I took that, even 50 something years since the founding of the field, this still animates a lot of the conversations about just what it is that people in Black studies do and what kind of work we ought to be doing, or what kind of work we how we should make departments, make curricula, all of these things. And so this is a long way of asking, how you imagine the field, especially in the context of its origins.
Well, I remember, again, this being, like a topic of intense conversation and discussion in my house, because when my mom made the transition from teaching elementary school to high school, part of what, as a social science teacher, she came along at a moment when, first as a teacher, she was trying to introduce something like, what we would recognize as Black studies into her high school curriculum, right? So that's one part of it. Second of all, she stopped teaching in the early 70s and became an administrator working for the State Department of Education in Nevada. And a whole lot of what she was working on was equal educational opportunity and transformation of curriculum. I wish I had it. One year, one of the best presents my partner ever gave me for my birthday. She actually found an article, an interview in some newspaper in Colorado, interviewing my mom about these questions.
Amazing.
I have it somewhere. It's in my computer, and I mean, I really, can't stress, her thinking on the matter was, and I'm prejudiced, obviously, but it was pretty advanced, and it was really about thinking about what was relevant for her students, thinking about what was also necessary which is to say, relevant for her Black students and necessary for her non-Black students, right? If the world was going to be other than what it was, and I guess what I'm saying is that debate around the nature and the importance and also the proper modalities, so to speak, of Black studies, it was already ongoing at the outset of the of it as a kind of as an intellectual formation within sort of normative educational institutions. And there was also, as you say, not only this movement that was pushing Black studies as a set of ideas, as a set of facts, but also as a set of intellectual attitudes, right? And sensibilities. There was a movement that was pushing into normative educational institutions from the Black community, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe even more generally from what one might call the broader community of those who were interested in the transformation of the earth, okay, or the world, and the saving of the earth. But there was also, interestingly, this feedback that was already going on, which was, how can the resources that have been sequestered in normative intellectual institutions and educational institutions be redistributed and recirculated outside of the boundaries of those institutions? And then the ethical question emerges, when we think about that redistribution, how do we make sure that what it is that's being redistributed isn't potentially toxic, right? As a function of its having been held in those institutions. And how quickly will that toxicity, which is of necessity in a certain sense, how quickly will that toxicity impact the very good and meaningful things which we had been trying to bring into those institutions, right? So and what I guess I'm suggesting is this is a problem that seems really immediate and deep to us now. I think it's immediate and deep for us now because we see that we are in the midst, and maybe that we have been in the midst for a long time, of the historical exclusion and expulsion, right, of these alternative modes of study, not just Black studies, women's studies, queer studies, right? We find now that a state of war has existed against those tendencies, and that the expulsion is in full effect. And if it seems like the intensity of that expulsion is in even more full effect in the last 2 weeks, that's probably true, but that ought not blind us to the ways in which that expulsion has been in effect for some time. So these questions are urgent to us now, but I believe that they were already urgent in 1968, in 1973, in 1974, and they were in effect, and those questions were urgent not only to people in the university and in these sort of nascent Black studies departments in the university, but these questions were urgent for high school teachers. These questions were urgent for people in the community who were, whatever, doing lunch programs or after school programs, or, in all the various sort of modalities of attending to Black subsistence that emerged in the wake of, what people call the civil rights movement, and they got filtered through the state in various ways, through anti-poverty programs or, social justice programs under Johnson especially, but even the way those programs persisted under Nixon and, up really until Reagan. So these, in other words, sorry, I feel like I'm blathering, but these are questions which are both old and new. Okay? And I think it's really important for us who now attend to the urgency of these questions in this moment to recognize that insofar as these questions were also urgent in the same way 50 years ago, we need to start reading and thinking about what people were saying back then. And I would say, and luckily for us, there are people who have been doing this work for a while. I'm thinking of people like, Noliwe Rooks and Nick Mitchell, but others too. There's, and it's, to make a long story short, it makes me think especially of my mentor in college, Martin Kilson, who was the first tenured Black professor at Harvard and who was a really great political scientist and who was kind of notorious, let's say, within the normative kind of foundations of Black studies for being, let's say somewhere on the tight spectrum between extremely skeptical and even maybe being against the academic institutionalization of Black study. Right? But what's interesting, I think, looking back on the articles and the letters to the editor that he was writing in the early and mid 70s about Black studies at Harvard, what's interesting about Kilson now, looking back on that stuff, is that I believe that his skepticism about the institutionalization of Black studies was in fact a function of his devotion to what one might call the absolute necessity of Black study. And he was concerned for what the institutionalization and the disciplinization, let's say, of Black studies would do to Black study as a kind of as an intellectual sensibility.
Yeah, it's interesting too. Thinking about that extension, that you described, and it was really interesting reflection. So thank you. The way you didn't start with the sort of student struggles, but started off with high school curricula, right, and the movement from elementary school. I think it's one of these reminders. It's something I've been thinking about for a long time, about how phrasing for the elimination of these kinds of programs is divisive concepts. But part of what's divisive about the concept is its cohesiveness, right? The way it ties all of these other kinds of relationships, whether it's, it's like reform and radical movements, it's curricula in preschools, it's hiring practices, it's healthcare, it's food, it's university courses. I think one of the questions that I heard in that, that I hear in that last comment about the institutionalization of Black studies is at what point do we break from that cohesiveness, right, and end up dividing ourselves off? It may leave us with very few allies under fire. I mean, this keeps coming up in these podcasts, and that's the thing that's really been on my mind. And the way you described that in that comment, that whole trajectory, it's both a reminder, as you said, to, people have been talking about this for a long time. So what does it mean to reconnect with those texts and that thinking and strategizing and tactics? But it's also a question of, like, what does it mean to have to be reminded? Where have we ended up that we needed this? So,
well, I mean, the specificity of Black struggle is such that this condition of being without allies is it feels like maybe it's a constitutive element of Black struggle. Okay. And what's also, and this is a problem, this is an interesting and also a difficult problem intellectually and existentially, is that what is also constitutive for Black struggle is that the solutions for being able to survive the war against Black subsistence are all, I believe, completely, necessarily general and generalizable, right? This is the problem. The problem is, what does it mean to have no allies, but to have no way to survive that is somehow exclusive, right? That our survival depends upon a general survival, right? This is I mean, at best, it's unfair and annoying, right? Why is it that my survival depends upon a survival also of my oppressor? Who else would put up with such a fucked up situation as that? Who wouldn't cry out against the absolute vicious irony of such an existential condition, right? Who should have to suffer that? And the answer to the question, of course, is we do, right? We do, right? And it's a debilitating contradiction within the history of Black study and Black struggle, and it is also an extraordinarily generative contradiction within that same history, right? It's somehow crippling and locomotive at the same time. Okay, this is a condition. Okay, and it's one of the things that then we have to think about, and the pressure of having to think about that is intense. And I would say that one of the elements that's true is that it produces an intense anti-disciplinary pressure,
Mm.
because I don't know that there is any normative discipline within, let's say the Western intellectual tradition that is equipped to stand up to that pressure.
Mm.
Philosophy can't stand up to that pressure. Okay. Literary studies on its own can't stand up to that pressure. Psychology can't, right. So this is again why the general sort of intellectual and affective sensibility of Black study is so important, because that's what gives us the tools and the attitude that will allow us to stand up to the pressure of this unthinkable thought that we have to be thinking all the time. Right. Okay. So that's one thing I would say. And I believe, and somehow it's connected to this other thing, which is you were suggesting, saying, yeah, I didn't start with, on the one hand, it seems, I guess I didn't start with student unrest and student uprising. I started with the teachers in a way, I suppose, rather than with the students. But I also think that part of what's happening as a function of this sort of this condition that we're in is that line between the teachers and the students, it tends to break down. And let's say one of the things that it does is it places a tremendous pressure on us to be okay with the fact that breaks down. Right? Like we have to live with the fact that breaks down. And so, for instance, there's really important work done by a professor, I think at Rutgers University. I think maybe she's in history, I'm not sure, named Donna Murch. And it's work she does on the sort of origins of the Black Panther Party in Oakland. And, I think what part of what her work does, at least in my interpretation of it, is that it requires us to complicate this notion that unrest precedes study, and of course that's important, not because it reverses an incorrect formulation, but because it allows us and requires us to consider the complexity, right, of a kind of social field and a social insurgency in which these origin stories just don't work. I don't know that if it's the case that unrest precedes study, it is also the case that unrest emerges from study, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So, and this is something that's clear not only in the history of the emergence of the Panthers, but it's clear in the history of, let's say, another moment, that isn't usually talked about this way, but it is a moment of student insurgency, which is the Little Rock Central. There's been a tendency to, maybe starting with Hannah Arendt, to think of those students as pawns for either the ill-conceived or well-meaning, aspirations of their parents or of older activists. But those students were, they were involved also in a practice of insurgency, and they were actively involved. And what's interesting is that their active involvement in that practice of insurgency began long before the day that they walked into that, into that school,
Yeah.
And the form that their insurgency took was study. They studied their way into that day when they walked into that school, and this is, the record, is clear on this. So, so I think, yeah, our Black insurgency has always been a studious insurgency, and Black
Really?
study has always been an insurgent study, so.
Yeah. That's really brilliantly put. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah. And I mean, I think it's probably related. And so, because I want to ask you about your own work. I'm sure it will come back to some of these questions as well. Your work is informed by performance and cultural studies, critical theory, literary studies, also practicing, creative as poet. And so I'm interested in hearing you talk a little bit about how you think this collection of orientations or sensibilities or practices, however you want to characterize it, how you think that fits in the history of the field of Black studies, fits you in that, but also what new boundaries do you think it pushes? What sort of new horizons do you think it opens up?
Well, I think about this. I was thinking about this morning, actually, because I'm trying to put the finishing touches on a book, which I'm really, if everything works out the way I hope, it'll be my last book, And so I'm trying to write an introduction, or whatever. And well, I would say that the people who are philosophers, they know that I'm not a philosopher. And the people who are really hardcore critical theorists, they know that that's not what I am. If you ask them, they'll tell you, and they can point to all those things in my work that fall short, let's say, of their sense of what a proper sort of thing is within their field. And I think the literary critics would tell you the same thing, and I'm pretty sure poets would tell you the same thing. So, and it's okay, because I've never felt comfortable, or that's not even the right way to put it. I not only have I not felt comfortable fitting into any of those categories, but I feel uncomfortable if I am made to do so, or made to try to do so. Probably the only place where I've ever felt pretty comfortable, or something like comfortable, is in performance studies, which, as a department, at least, and I really think about it much more as a department, which is to say the particular department that I teach in at NYU, more so maybe even than a field. But I think of the department as a kind of island of misfit toys, It's like it's a department that's full of people who don't have degrees in what it is that we're supposed to be teaching, And the only two people I think now we've got younger couple junior scholars who are very brilliant, who one of whom I think might have a degree in performance studies. And we've in the past had a couple people who are alumni of our department but we're a kind of place where people go when they don't have any place else to go. And if I've ever felt comfortable in an academic setting, it's been here with the other people who didn't have any place else to go, but I would also say that feeling of, let's say, of a kind of comfort in performance studies is the same feeling that I would say I have in Black studies, which is just, and here it's like a slightly sort of mirror image thing. I don't necessarily feel comfortable in the field of performance studies, but I feel comfortable in the department of performance studies that I work in somewhat. And by same token, but in a sort of weird reversal, I don't know that I feel all that comfortable. I don't know that I would ever feel all that comfortable in the department of Black studies. Like, I've worked in departments of Black studies before and it didn't feel so great. But I do kind of feel comfortable in the field of Black studies, which I think of as a kind of open field, and which I believe in and I'm committed to, because I believe that it is inseparable, from the even more open and general field of Black study. Now, I think Black study sometimes has to protect itself from Black studies, right? Insofar as Black studies can very easily be made to bear those toxicities of normative disciplinarity and institutionality. But anyway, so all of that is just to say that if there is such a thing as my work, which I'm pretty sure there isn't, but there's no way to say this that doesn't sound disingenuous or falsely modest. I just know, but I know that what I'm saying is true. I can't separate anything I've done from the general project, right? Like, none of it makes sense outside the general project of Black study. Okay, there's not a single bit of it. I don't think any of it is original or originary. Not a single bit of it. And I know there are people who are within the field of Black studies who can talk comfortably about what they call their work or their project, and they feel much more comfortable than I do separating their work and their project from other people's, and even and especially they might feel comfortable separating their work or their project from other people in the field who they disagree with about certain fundamental things. But even the people who I disagree with, about really fundamental things, I find that I can't separate my work from my project from theirs. Where there's a kind of entanglement there that cannot be defended against. And sometimes it makes me uncomfortable. And in the same way that I imagine it would make some other people feel uncomfortable to think that that their thing is entangled up with what they perceive as my thing. But
Hmm.
I don't say I like it all the time. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
but there's nothing that I can do about it. And at the end of the day, there's nothing that I would want to do about it.
So I really that sense of entanglement and the pleasures and displeasures that come from it. I think that's a really important thing to think about in that context of. So, I mean, in some ways, just repeating what you said around this. I do think it's a tension in Black studies and non-disciplinary fields, departments, and so forth. Is just how do you negotiate that relationship between standardization, which fields sort of have almost a compulsion towards. And I think there's something important to think about with that. And also what you called, and I'm going to adopt this phrase, right, the island of misfit toys model, which has a sense of freedom and improvisation and unpredictability, even kind of productive chaos to it.
Mm-hmm.
But as you said, that the misfit toys, I mean, they are on an island, right?
Yeah.
That is that they are entangled in some ways.
Yeah.
So I think that's such a, I'm going to be thinking about the way you put that is what I'm trying to say. I think it's super interesting.
Well, the cool thing about the island of misfit toys is that
it's also my favorite part of that particular show.
Yeah. Herbie the dentist, I just want to be a dentist, I don't want to be an elf. I don't want to make toys. I want to fix teeth. But the thing about being on an island like that is that, I've got to look around, I'm getting ready to do a bad thing, which he hates, is to talk about my son, who I would say, the three biggest intellectual influences for me, after my mom, which is an accident of birth, it's been my partner and our two kids. And I would say maybe over the last, up until the last couple of years, that is skewed much more in the direction of our older son, who, is neurodivergent is the term that he has taken up to use, which I think is cool. But having to, a lot of our life was built up around trying to understand that particular divergency within a field of divergency, and to try to figure out how to best get him prepared for a world, that is not, welcoming to divergence, And so it's included a lot of reading and a lot of therapy and stuff like that. And we've had a lot of help and support from really great people, one of whom was former speech therapist of his, who used to say, well, Lorenzo just needs to find his people. So one of the cool things about being on the island of misfit toys is you find your people, you found your people. But what if it turns out that the benefit of being on an island with your people is all bound up with the potential hazard of, what if it turns out that neurodivergency is the norm rather than the deviance from the norm?
Mm-hmm.
Then that means that there's a whole lot of people running around who haven't found their people and who have figured out ways to cover over their own divergence, which includes the most usual way that you cover over your own divergence, which is to brutalize the divergence of others, right? In order to prove, So there's a whole lot of misfit toys out there who have been fighting really hard to not recognize their own misfittedness, and who, are pretty committed, to the refusal of that misfittedness, which manifests itself as brutal forms of persecution. So, what I guess what I'm trying to say is that's why the sensibility that emerges from within that island is so important, right? And it is also why the forces of the norm, are so committed to the destruction of that sensibility, right? Okay. And so I kind of feel like, and then there's another tendency, another danger, okay, which is that the island of misfit toys might decide at a certain point that they need to form a government. That they need some state apparatuses, that they need, to that they need to protect themselves and to protect their boundary. And and then and before you know it, the island of misfit toys becomes the state of misfitia or something, right? And it won't take long before that state starts to do bad things, right? And states have two modalities of doing bad things. They do bad things to their own citizens, and then they do bad things to everybody who's not a citizen, both within and outside of the state. So this becomes, now I'm not trying to be flippant, but if Black Studies is also an island of misfit toys, or for that matter, if performance studies is an island of misfit toys, then one of the really important things that has to be done constantly in performance studies and in Black studies is to fight the temptation of that kind of self-institutionalization, right? And the exclusionary way in which that institutionalization takes itself up. And again, this is extraordinarily unfair, right? Because if anybody, right, if any group has the natural, undisputed right to figure out ways to protect itself, given the absolute duress it's under, wouldn't it be the group of misfit toys, right? Who has more of a right to have a fucking army than the who has a more of a right, right? So this is, and yet to do so would be against the grain, of the absolute, necessity and the absolute beauty of our ongoing misfittedness, right? Which we should try to cultivate, right? And share,
I love this. No, this is, in some ways, I've, just two questions I wanted to wrap up with. And, that, who has more of a right to an army, but that's also the danger. I mean, it's, laying out this sort of pharmacons, the cure and the poison at the same time, maybe is already a little bit of an answer to this question, which is, what do you think Black Studies has done well, but also what do you think it has not done particularly well?
Well, it's a hard question just because, as I guess what I've said in the previous few minutes indicates, it's hard to separate what you do well from what you don't do well,
Yeah.
It's like what you do well is kind of all bound up with what you don't do well, So I would say that one of the things that Black Studies has done really well is really, really well. Okay, I'm gonna use the language of a person whose work, to put it in those terms, has been maybe extraordinarily influential and rightly so for the last 50 years, and whose influence, to my mind, has also at the same time been extremely baleful. Okay, and that person is Orlando Patterson. Okay, and what I would say, is that what Black Studies has done really, 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 really well is defend the honor of the dishonored. Okay. And what Black Studies has done not so well is accede to the metaphysical foundations of the very idea of honor. I guess I should elaborate, but
no. I'm happy to leave it at that. That's I like that. That's something for us to really think about. I see what you mean. And that's, like I said, when I asked the question, I was like, in some ways you had just answered it, but I like that as a formulation for us to sit with. That's profound shit, Fred. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Let me ask then as a final question, thinking in the context of Black Studies and our moment, what's the issue that you think we should all be thinking about, and or what's the question you'd like us all to ask?
Oh man, well, I'll put it in these terms. The issue. I borrow this from a good friend of mine, and a great thinker whose thinking should be more well known, and is not more well known because, he's maybe been on the edges, of the university system in a certain kind of figural way, undocumented, untenured, kind of not so much unemployable, but underemployed, within it. His name is Manolo Callahan. And this is a phrase that I got from him, which I think he's got from other people. It's great, Gustavo Esteva, this great Mexican thinker and organizer who was a kind of student, I suppose, and compatriot of Ivan Illich. And the issue in Manolo's terms, at least where I got it from, is we have to renew our habits of assembly. That's the most important issue. And in terms of the questions, I would say I think there's probably really just two questions, you know? So one of them I would say is a kind of, I think of it as a kind of social physics question, right? And in that thinking, I'm definitely trying to hopefully thinking along with Denise Da Silva and, Karen Barad, and really going back to Du Bois, and this very great essay of his that I've been obsessed with for a long time, since being introduced to it a couple of different times by R.A. Judy and by Nahum Chandler. The essay called Sociology Hesitant, which is published in 1905, in which, everybody talks about 1905 as Einstein's annus mirabilis, the miracle year, in which he revolutionized physics with these 4 really important papers. Well, the 5th great paper in physics in 1905 was not written by Einstein, but it was written by Du Bois. And if you read it, if people read it, they'll see what I mean. But the first question is a physics question, and it is well, there's a kind of polite way to say it, but the polite way is imprecise, and that way would be, how do things go together? The much more precise way to say it in the vernacular of Black study is, how does shit go together? And then the second question is an ethical question, which is inseparable from this social physics question. And it is, what are we doing? But there's a more precise way to put it in the vernacular of Black study. And it is, what the fuck are we doing? We have to ask ourselves that all the time, right? So the issue is, how do we renew our habits of assembly? The questions are, how does shit go together? And what the fuck are we doing?
Beautiful place to end. I love that. Yeah. Thank you so much for this, Fred. This has been really, really thoughtful, super interesting. I was really excited to get you on the series, and it's been everything and more than what I was hoping for. So thank you for your time, because I appreciate that. I mean, took time out of your Friday.
I appreciate y'all doing these podcasts. They're really, really important. And I want to say I appreciate the work and the writing that you've done. And the work on Levinas, the work on Glissant, I feel like I'm still catching up to it, and I want to be able to acknowledge that to you here now.
Oh, thank you.
And also to more fully acknowledge it in what I've been, what I'm writing now too, because it's extraordinarily important and generative, and I'm really proud and happy to be part of the project that you're into. So thank you.
Thank you. That's really nice of you to say. I appreciate that a lot, man. So thank you again. Great rest of your day.
You too. Thanks, man.
Bye-bye.
Bye.